The sun had long dipped below the horizon, leaving the suburban streets cloaked in shadows. The faint hum of crickets filled the air, interrupted only by the occasional bark of a dog or the distant rumble of a car engine. It was a quiet neighborhood, one where people prided themselves on safety and familiarity, but tonight something felt off. Tension hung heavy in the atmosphere, like an invisible storm waiting to break. Officer Kyle Miller sat stiffly in his patrol car, his hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than usual. He wasn't new to this line of work. He'd been wearing the badge for nearly a decade, but lately things seemed different. Crime reports were up, and so were complaints from residents about strangers lurking around late at night. Some neighbors whispered about burglaries. Others mentioned suspicious figures seen near schools. The pressure to act was mounting, and Kyle felt it pressing down on him like a weight. As he turned onto Maple Street, his headlights swept across rows of neatly trimmed lawns and parked cars. Everything appeared normal, almost too normal. That's when he saw her, a woman walking briskly down an alley between two houses. She wore dark jeans, a plain black hoodie pulled up over her head, and carried a small backpack slung over one shoulder. Something about the way she moved caught his attention. It wasn't just that she was out so late. It was the deliberate quickness of her steps, as if she didn't want anyone to notice her. Kyle slowed the car and leaned forward slightly, narrowing his eyes. His instincts kicked in immediately. Who walks through back alleys at this hour? He muttered under his breath. To him, she looked out of place, maybe even suspicious. He couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He pulled over and stepped out of the car, his boots crunching against the gravel beneath his feet. The sound startled the woman, who stopped abruptly and turned to face him. Her features came into view under the dim glow of a nearby street lamp. She was young, probably in her late 20s, with smooth brown skin and sharp cheekbones. Her expression remained calm, but there was a flicker of surprise in her wide, dark eyes. "Ma'am," Kyle called out, raising his voice enough to be heard clearly. "Can I have a word with you?" The woman hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Sure," she said evenly, her tone polite but guarded. "What's going on?" Kyle approached her cautiously, his hand resting instinctively on the holster of his gun. "I'm Officer Miller," he began, his tone clipped and formal. "Do you live around here?" "Yes," she replied without hesitation. "I live on Oak Lane. I was just heading home after stopping by the convenience store." Kyle frowned. There was nothing particularly alarming about her answer, but something still didn't sit well with him. Maybe it was the hoodie. Hoodies always made him uneasy. Or maybe it was the fact that she hadn't offered any explanation for why she'd chosen such an indirect route home. Whatever it was, his suspicion grew. "Well, ma'am, we've had some reports recently about break-ins in this area," he continued, his voice hardening slightly. "You wouldn't mind showing me some ID, would you?" The woman sighed softly, reaching into the pocket of her hoodie. "Of course not," she said, pulling out a wallet. As she flipped it open to retrieve her identification, Kyle's gaze locked onto her movements. Every action seemed magnified in his mind. Was she stalling? Was she hiding something? "Hold it!" Kyle barked suddenly, taking a step back. "Keep your hands where I can see them." The woman froze, her fingers still clutching the edge of her wallet. Confusion flashed across her face. "What's the problem?" she asked, her voice steady despite the tension in the air. "I'm just getting my ID." But Kyle wasn't listening anymore. In his mind, every second counted. Every movement could mean danger. His training told him to stay alert, to assume the worst until proven otherwise. And right now, all he could focus on was the possibility that this woman might not be who she claimed to be. "I said, keep your hands visible," he repeated louder this time. His hand tightened around the grip of his weapon as he raised it slightly, pointing it in her direction. "Don't make any sudden moves." The woman slowly lowered her wallet back into her pocket, raising both, hands above her waist. Okay, she said firmly, trying to sound reassuring. "I'm cooperating. There's no need for this." But Kyle's heart was pounding now. Adrenaline coursed through his veins, clouding his judgment. He thought about the recent string of crimes in the area, about how quickly situations could spiral out of control. He thought about the color of her skin and the stereotypes that had been drilled into him over years of subtle conditioning. And most of all, he thought about protecting himself. Without another word, he shouted, "Turn around, face the wall." She obeyed, turning slowly with her hands still raised. But as she did, her foot brushed against a loose stone, causing a soft scraping sound. To Kyle, it sounded like the click of a gun being cocked. Panic surged through him, erasing any semblance of rational thought. In that split second, he made a decision, one that would change both their lives forever. His finger squeezed the trigger. The gunshot echoed through the silent night, shattering the stillness. The woman cried out, stumbling forward as pain shot through her side. She collapsed to the ground, clutching her wound, her breath coming in ragged gasps. For a moment, everything went quiet. Kyle stood frozen, his gun still aimed at her trembling form. Reality crashed over him like a wave, bringing with it a mix of shock, fear, and disbelief. What had he done? Had he really just fired his weapon at an unarmed civilian? Call an ambulance," the woman managed to choke out, her voice weak but clear. Tears streamed down her face, though whether from pain or anger, Kyle couldn't tell. It took several seconds for him to snap out of his daze. Lowering his weapon, he reached for his radio with shaking hands. "Dispatch, I need medical assistance at Maple Street near Oak Lane," he stammered, his voice unsteady. "There's been an incident." As he waited for help to arrive, Kyle stared at the woman lying on the ground. For the first time, he noticed the fear in her eyes, the vulnerability in her posture. She wasn't a threat. She never had been. Yet here she was, bleeding because of his actions, and deep down, buried beneath layers of denial and defensiveness, Kyle knew the truth. This wasn't just about protecting himself. It was about prejudice, about assumptions based on appearances. But admitting that would mean facing a part of himself he'd rather ignore. So instead, he clenched his jaw and tried to convince himself that he'd done what any officer would do in his position. Little did he know, the real consequences of his actions were only beginning. The ambulance arrived within minutes, its red and blue lights flashing against the darkened streets. Paramedics rushed to the scene, their movements quick but deliberate as they assessed the injured woman. Michelle Carter lay on the cold ground, her breathing shallow and uneven. Blood seeped through her hoodie, staining the fabric around her side. Despite the pain, she remained conscious, her eyes wide with shock and anger. Officer Kyle Miller stood a few feet away, his face pale and his hands trembling. He watched as the paramedics carefully lifted Michelle onto a stretcher and secured her for transport. His mind raced with conflicting thoughts. On one hand, he felt a gnawing sense of guilt. Had he overreacted? Could he have handled the situation differently? On the other hand, a part of him clung to the belief that he had acted in self-defense, that any officer would have done the same under similar circumstances. As the ambulance sped off toward the hospital, Kyle called his sergeant to report what had happened. His voice was shaky, his words jumbled. He tried to explain the sequence of events, emphasizing how the woman's actions had seemed suspicious. "She reached into her pocket," he said, his tone defensive. "I thought she might be armed." His sergeant listened quietly before instructing him to file a detailed report at the station. "This is going to get messy," the older man warned, his voice low and serious. "Be prepared for questions, not just from us, but from the public too." By morning, news of the shooting spread like wildfire. Local television stations aired footage of the crime scene, showing the bloodstains left behind on the pavement. Social media exploded with outrage, hashtags like "Justice for Michelle" trending across platforms. Protesters began gathering outside the police station, holding signs that read, "Stop police brutality and accountability now." The community was divided. Some defended Kyle's actions, while others demanded justice for Michelle. At the hospital, Michelle lay in a sterile room hooked up to machines that monitored her vital signs. The bullet had grazed her side, causing significant pain but sparing her any life-threatening damage. Doctors assured her she would recover fully, though the emotional scars were another story. As soon as she was stable enough to speak, detectives arrived to take her statement. Michelle recounted the events calmly, her voice steady despite the trauma she had endured. She explained that she had been walking home after buying groceries when Officer Miller stopped her. "He asked for my ID," she said, her brow furrowing as she recalled the moment. "I was reaching for it when he started yelling. I didn't understand why he was so aggressive. Then, out of nowhere, he shot me." Her words painted a starkly different picture from Kyle's version of events. While he claimed she posed a threat, Michelle insisted she had done nothing wrong. Her demeanor, composed, yet deeply hurt, struck a chord with the officers interviewing her. One detective, a middle-aged woman named Laura Bennett, couldn't help but feel uneasy about the discrepancies in their accounts. Meanwhile, back at the station, Kyle faced mounting pressure. Internal Affairs launched an investigation into the Yao incident, questioning not only his actions that night but also his conduct throughout his career. Some colleagues rallied around him, offering support and defending his reputation. Others kept their distance, wary of being associated with someone embroiled in controversy. "You're going to need a good lawyer," one veteran officer advised Kyle during a private conversation. "This isn't just about you anymore. It's about race, politics, and trust in law enforcement. People are watching." Kyle nodded grimly, knowing the advice was sound. Still, he struggled to accept the reality of his situation. How had things escalated so quickly? Why did everyone seem to assume the worst about him? He replayed the events, in his mind over and over, searching for answers but finding none. As days passed, the case garnered national attention. Journalists descended upon the small town, eager to capture every detail of the unfolding drama. News outlets interviewed residents, many of whom expressed mixed feelings about the incident. Some described Kyle as a dedicated officer who cared about his community. Others accused him of harboring racial biases, pointing to past complaints filed against him for discriminatory behavior. Amid the chaos, Michelle became a reluctant symbol of resilience. Friends and family visited her in the hospital, bringing flowers and messages of support. They urged her to focus on healing, but Michelle found it hard to ignore the larger implications of what had happened. She knew this wasn't just about her. It was about countless others who had faced similar injustices. One evening, as Michelle scrolled through her phone, she noticed something unusual. Dozens of messages poured in from unknown numbers, all expressing solidarity and admiration. Strangers shared stories of their own encounters with police brutality, thanking her for speaking out. For the first time since the shooting, Michelle felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe her experience could spark change, even if it came at great personal cost. But there was still one crucial piece of information no one outside her inner circle knew. Michelle wasn't just an ordinary citizen. She was an undercover FBI agent, working on a high-profile case involving human trafficking. Her superiors had closely monitored the situation, debating whether to reveal her identity or let the investigation proceed without interference. Ultimately, they decided to keep her cover intact for now, but they couldn't ignore the potential fallout. "We'll handle this carefully," Agent Robert Ellis, Michelle's commanding officer, assured her during a visit to the hospital. "Your safety is our priority, but we also need to protect the integrity of your mission." Michelle nodded, understanding the delicate balance they had to maintain. Still, the secrecy weighed heavily on her. She wanted to tell her side of the story, to expose the truth about who she really was. But for the sake of the operation, she agreed to stay silent for the time being. Back at the station, Kyle's world continued to unravel. Evidence surfaced suggesting a pattern of prejudiced behavior in his past interactions with minority communities. A former colleague anonymously leaked documents detailing several instances where Kyle had used excessive force or made derogatory remarks. The revelations fueled public outrage, turning the narrative further against him. Feeling cornered, Kyle lashed out at those closest to him. During a heated argument with his wife Emily, he snapped, "You don't understand what it's like out there. You don't see the threats I face every day." Emily stared at him, tears welling in her eyes. Maybe if you weren't so quick to judge people based on how they look, you wouldn't be in this mess, she shot back. Her words stung, cutting deeper than Kyle cared to admit. Alone and overwhelmed, Kyle began to question everything he thought he knew about himself. Was he truly the dedicated officer he believed he was? Or was he guilty of the very biases he claimed to oppose? The weight of these thoughts pressed down on him, leaving him sleepless and consumed by doubt. As the days turned into weeks, the tension in the town reached a boiling point. Protests grew larger and more vocal, demanding accountability not only for Kyle, but for systemic issues within law enforcement. Community leaders organized town hall meetings, inviting residents to share their experiences and propose solutions. For the first time, uncomfortable conversations about race and policing took center stage. Through it all, Michelle remained a central figure in the story. Though still recovering physically, she channeled her energy into advocating for reform. She spoke at rallies, met with activists, and collaborated with local organizations to push for policy changes. Her determination inspired others to join the fight, creating a ripple effect that extended far beyond the confines of her hometown. Yet, despite the growing momentum, Michelle knew the road ahead would be long and difficult. Change rarely came easily, especially when it challenged deeply ingrained systems of power. But she refused to give up. If anything, the shooting had strengthened her resolve to make a difference, not just for herself, but for future generations. Little did anyone know the most shocking twist in the story was yet to come. Unbeknownst to Kyle, Michelle, and the rest of the world, the courtroom battle looming on the horizon would unearth secrets that would redefine everything. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as people filed in, filling every available seat. Reporters jostled for position near the front, their cameras ready to capture every moment. Protesters gathered outside, holding signs and chanting slogans that echoed through the halls. The air was thick with tension, a mix of anger, curiosity, and hope. This wasn't just another trial. It was a reckoning, a chance to confront the deep-rooted issues plaguing society. Officer Kyle Miller sat at the defendant's table, his shoulders slumped and his face pale. He stared straight ahead, avoiding eye contact with anyone. His lawyer, a sharp but weary-looking man named Mr. Dawson, flipped through papers, occasionally whispering something into Kyle's ear. Despite his outward calm, Kyle's mind raced. He had rehearsed his testimony countless times, yet he couldn't shake the feeling that this day would change everything, for better or worse. On the other side of the room, Michelle Carter sat, upright, her expression composed but her eyes sharp with determination. She wore a simple blouse and skirt, her injured side still tender, but healing. Next to her sat Laura Bennett, the detective who had taken her initial statement, along with a team of prosecutors eager to hold Kyle accountable. Behind them, rows of supporters, friends, family, activists, nodded encouragingly whenever Michelle glanced their way. As the judge entered and called the court to order, the room fell silent. The proceedings began with opening statements. The prosecution painted Kyle's actions as reckless and racially motivated, emphasizing how his assumptions about Michelle had led to an unnecessary escalation. They argued that his conduct not only endangered an innocent person, but also undermined public trust in law enforcement. Kyle's defense countered by portraying him as a dedicated officer caught in a high-pressure situation. Officer Miller acted based on information available to him at the time, Mr. Dawson insisted. He believed he was facing a potential threat and responded accordingly. This is not a case of malice but of human error. The first witness called to testify was Officer Dawson himself. Under questioning from the prosecution, he recounted the events leading up to the shooting. When asked why he felt threatened, Kyle hesitated before answering. She reached into her pocket, he said, his voice quieter than expected. I thought she might have a weapon. The prosecutor pressed him further. Did you ask her what she was reaching for? Kyle shifted uncomfortably in his seat. No, I didn't, but given the circumstances, I couldn't take any chances. The prosecutor raised an eyebrow. Given the circumstances? What exactly were those circumstances? Officer Miller? Was it because she was walking in an alley? Or was it because of how she looked? Kyle bristled at the implication. It wasn't about how she looked, he snapped, though his tone lacked conviction. It was about her behavior. The exchange set the tone for the rest of the hearing. Witness after witness took the stand, each adding pieces to the puzzle. Some testified about Kyle's history of discriminatory behavior, citing past complaints filed against him. Others described Michelle as kind and responsible, someone who had never caused trouble. The evidence against Kyle seemed overwhelming, but his defense fought back fiercely, attempting to cast doubt on the prosecution's narrative. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for, Michelle's testimony. As she stepped onto the stand, the room fell silent. All eyes were on her, watching intently as she recounted the night of the shooting. Her voice was steady, her words clear and deliberate. She described how Kyle had stopped her, how he had grown increasingly aggressive despite her cooperation, and how she had been shot while simply trying to show her ID. I followed every instruction he gave me, Michelle said, her gaze locking onto Kyle's. I did nothing wrong. And yet here I am today, recovering from a gunshot wound because of assumptions he made about me. Her words resonated deeply, drawing murmurs of agreement from the crowd. Even some jurors exchanged glances, visibly moved by her account. For the first time, cracks began to form in Kyle's carefully constructed defense, but the real bombshell came later, during cross-examination. The prosecutor leaned forward slightly, his tone casual but probing. Ms. Carter, he began, can you tell us what you were doing in that alley that night? Michelle paused, taking a deep breath. Everyone could sense that something significant was about to happen. I was conducting surveillance, she said finally, her voice firm. I'm an undercover FBI agent working on a federal investigation into human trafficking. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Heads turned in disbelief, whispers, breaking out like wildfire. Even the judge raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. Kyle's jaw dropped, his face turning ghostly white. His lawyer scrambled to regroup, but it was too late. The revelation had already sent shockwaves through the room. The prosecutor seized the opportunity, pressing Michelle for more details. She explained how she had been gathering evidence related to a major trafficking operation, describing the stakes involved in her mission. My work is critical to dismantling a dangerous network, she said. That night, I was following leads when Officer Miller intervened. His actions not only put my life at risk but also jeopardized an ongoing federal operation. When Michelle finished speaking, the courtroom erupted in murmurs once again. Jurors scribbled notes furiously, their expressions reflecting a mix of awe and disbelief. The prosecution used the moment to drive home its point. This isn't just about one woman being shot, the lead prosecutor declared. It's about systemic failures that allow prejudice to override professionalism. It's about accountability, not just for Officer Miller, but for all of us. For Kyle, the revelation hit like a freight train. Everything he thought he knew about that night crumbled around him. Michelle wasn't just a random civilian. She was a highly trained federal agent risking her life to protect others. The weight of his mistake bore down on him, heavier than ever before. Outside the courtroom, news of Michelle's true identity spread rapidly. Social media lit up with reactions, ranging from outrage to admiration. Journalists rushed to update their stories, framing the case in a new light. Overnight, Michelle became a national figure, hailed as both a victim of injustice and a hero fighting for a greater cause. Back inside, the defense struggled to recover. Mr. Dawson attempted to downplay the significance of Michelle's role, arguing that Kyle couldn't have known she was an FBI agent. How was he supposed to guess? He demanded. She wasn't wearing a badge or identifying herself as law enforcement. The prosecution countered swiftly. That's precisely the point, they argued. You don't get to assume someone is guilty until proven innocent. You don't get to decide whether someone deserves respect based on appearances. That's not how justice works. As the hearing drew to a close, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. What had started as a straightforward case of police misconduct had evolved into something far more complex. A stark reminder of the biases embedded within institutions meant to serve and protect. For Michelle, it was validation of her fight for reform. For Kyle, it was a harsh awakening to the consequences of his actions. When the judge adjourned the session, Kyle remained seated long after others had left. He stared blankly at the empty chair where Michelle had sat, replaying her testimony in his mind. The image of her standing strong, revealing her true identity, haunted him. He realized now that his assumptions weren't just wrong. They were dangerous. They had cost him dearly, and they had nearly cost Michelle her life. Outside, Michelle stood surrounded by supporters, reporters shouting questions from every direction. She answered calmly, using the platform to advocate for change. "This isn't about revenge," she said firmly. "It's about making sure no one else has to go through what I did. We need accountability, we need reform, and we need it now." As the sun set over the courthouse, casting long shadows across the steps, the battle for justice continued. The road ahead promised challenges, but for the first time in weeks there was a glimmer of hope. Perhaps, Michelle thought, this tragedy could become a catalyst for meaningful change. The days following the courtroom revelation were a whirlwind of emotions and events. For Officer Kyle Miller, life became unbearable. The weight of what he had done pressed down on him constantly, heavier than any punishment a court could impose. His name was everywhere, on television screens, in newspaper headlines, and across social media platforms. People debated his actions, dissecting every detail of the case. Some called him a monster, others labeled him a scapegoat. But no matter the opinion, one thing remained clear. Kyle's reputation was shattered. At work, things grew worse. Internal affairs investigators dug deeper into his past, uncovering more examples of discriminatory behavior. Complaints from years ago resurfaced, painting a troubling picture of an officer who often let bias guide his decisions. Co-workers who once stood by him began to distance themselves, fearing association with someone now seen as toxic. Even his closest friends on the force avoided eye contact in the hallways, leaving Kyle isolated and alone. At home, the tension reached a breaking point. Emily, Kyle's wife, struggled to reconcile the man she loved with the person described in the news. She wanted to believe he wasn't racist, that he was simply a product of a flawed system. But the evidence was hard to ignore. During dinner one night, she finally voiced her frustration. "How could you not see how wrong this was?" she asked, tears streaming down her face. "You judged her before even knowing who she was." Kyle didn't have an answer. He sat there silently, staring at his untouched plate, guilt gnawing at him like a relentless beast. For the first time in his life, he questioned everything he thought he knew about himself. Was he truly the good guy he believed he was? Or was he just another cog in a machine that perpetuated inequality? Meanwhile, Michelle Carter focused on healing, not just physically but emotionally. The gunshot wound continued to heal, though scars would remain as permanent reminders of that fateful night. But it was the emotional toll that weighed most heavily on her. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by nightmares of the alley and the sound of the gunshot echoing endlessly. Yet despite the pain, Michelle refused to let bitterness consume her. Instead, she channeled her energy into advocacy, determined to turn her tragedy into a force for change. Her FBI superiors supported her decision, recognizing the opportunity to highlight systemic issues within law enforcement. They allowed her to take a temporary leave from her undercover duties so she could focus on public speaking engagements and community outreach. Michelle traveled to schools, churches, and town halls, sharing her story and urging people to demand accountability. Her message resonated deeply, inspiring others to join the fight against racial injustice. One evening, after a particularly moving speech, a young woman approached Michelle with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said softly. "I've been afraid to speak up about my own experiences with police brutality, but hearing your story gives me hope." Michelle smiled gently, placing a hand on the woman's shoulder. "Your voice matters," she replied. We can't fix these problems unless we talk about them openly. As weeks turned into months, the legal process continued its slow grind. New evidence emerged during discovery, further complicating Kyle's defense. Surveillance footage from nearby homes showed Michelle walking calmly through the alley, her movements unthreatening. Witnesses testified that she had been cooperative throughout the encounter, undermining Kyle's claim of feeling endangered. Meanwhile, experts highlighted flaws in his decision-making, pointing out that proper protocol required de-escalation rather than immediate use of lethal force. Public opinion shifted decisively against Kyle. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse, daily their chants growing louder and more insistent. Signs reading "Justice for Michelle" and "Accountability Saves Lives" filled the streets. Local leaders joined the movement, calling for sweeping reforms to address systemic racism in policing. It seemed as though the entire community had united behind Michelle's cause. Yet amidst the chaos, Kyle wrestled with his conscience. Late at night, when the house was quiet and sleep eluded him, he replayed the events over and over in his mind. He thought about Michelle's testimony, the way she had looked directly at him while revealing her identity as an FBI agent. He thought about the countless messages he had received online, some filled with hate and others offering forgiveness. Most of all, he thought about the lives he might have saved if he hadn't pulled the trigger. One morning, unable to bear the isolation any longer, Kyle decided to reach out to a therapist recommended by his lawyer. Sitting in the small office, surrounded by calming colors and soft lighting, he broke down completely. Tears streamed down his face as he confessed his fears, regrets, and doubts. "I never meant to hurt anyone," he sobbed, "but I did. And now I don't know how to live with myself." The therapist listened patiently, nodding occasionally. When Kyle finished speaking, she offered gentle advice. "Facing your mistakes is the first step toward redemption," she said. "It won't be easy, but acknowledging the harm you caused is crucial. Only then can you begin to make amends." Inspired by her words, Kyle made a decision. He started attending community meetings organized by activists, listening quietly as residents shared their frustrations and fears. At first, he felt out of place, unsure whether he belonged in such spaces. But gradually he realized that understanding others' perspectives was key to rebuilding trust, not just for himself, but for the entire system he represented. During one meeting, a middle-aged man stood up and addressed the crowd. "I lost my son to police violence 3 years ago," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "He was unarmed, just like Michelle, and I'm tired of seeing families destroyed because of fear and ignorance." Kyle felt a lump rise in his throat. For the first time, he saw the human cost of his actions reflected in someone else's pain. After the meeting ended, he approached the man hesitantly. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I can't imagine what you've been through." The man studied him for a moment before nodding. "Apologies won't bring my son back," he replied, "but maybe they'll help prevent another family from going through the same thing." Their brief conversation left a lasting impression on Kyle. He returned home that night with renewed determination to confront his biases and become part of the solution. While he knew forgiveness wouldn't come easily, and perhaps not at all, he vowed to do whatever it took to contribute to meaningful change. Back in the courtroom, the trial entered its final stages. Both sides delivered closing arguments, passionately summarizing their cases. The prosecution reiterated how Kyle's actions stemmed from prejudice, emphasizing the broader implications for marginalized communities. The defense argued for leniency, highlighting Kyle's remorse and lack of prior criminal intent. When the judge instructed the jury to deliberate, the room fell silent. Everyone waited anxiously, aware that the verdict would carry monumental consequences. For Kyle, it represented judgment not only of his actions, but of his character. For Michelle, it symbolized validation of her struggle and a step toward justice. Outside, protesters held vigils, lighting candles and singing songs of hope. Inside, Michelle sat quietly, her hands clasped tightly together. She didn't know what the outcome would be, but she felt a sense of peace. Regardless of the verdict, she had already sparked important conversations. She had already inspired change. As hours passed, the jury finally reached a decision. The foreman stood, his voice steady as he read the verdict aloud. Guilty on multiple counts, including excessive use of force and violating civil rights. Gasps filled the courtroom, followed by applause from Michelle's supporters. Tears welled in her eyes as she hugged Laura Bennett, the detective who had stood by her side throughout the ordeal. For Kyle, the verdict felt like both a relief and a condemnation. Relief because the uncertainty was over, and condemnation because he now faced the full weight of his actions. As bailiffs escorted him out of the courtroom, he glanced at Michelle one last time. Their eyes met briefly, and for a fleeting moment he thought he saw a flicker of understanding in hers. The road ahead promised challenges for everyone involved. For Michelle, it meant continuing her advocacy work and pushing for systemic reforms. For Kyle, it meant grappling with the consequences of his choices and striving for redemption. And for the community, it meant coming together to build a future where tragedies like this no longer occurred. Though wounds remained raw, there was a glimmer of hope, a belief that even in darkness light could emerge. The courtroom verdict sent shockwaves through the town. Guilty on all counts, excessive use of force violating civil rights and reckless endangerment. For Officer Kyle Miller, it was a moment of reckoning. The judge sentenced him to 5 years in prison, along with mandatory counseling and community service upon release. It wasn't the harshest sentence possible, but it was enough to make a statement. Accountability mattered. As Kyle stood to be taken away, his face remained blank, though his eyes betrayed the turmoil inside him. He glanced at Michelle one last time before disappearing behind the heavy wooden doors of the courthouse. Outside, the crowd erupted into cheers, some raising their fists in triumph while others hugged each other tightly. Justice had been served, or so it seemed. But justice is rarely simple. For Michelle Carter, the victory felt bittersweet. Yes, Kyle had been held accountable, but the scars left by that night would never fully heal. Every time she looked in the mirror, she saw the faint line on her side where the bullet had grazed her skin, a permanent reminder of what she had endured. Worse still were the nights when sleep eluded her, haunted by flashes of the alley and the deafening crack of gunfire. Despite these struggles, Michelle refused to let bitterness take root. She focused instead on the bigger picture, channeling her energy into advocacy work. Her speeches became more powerful, her words sharper and more urgent. She traveled across the country speaking at rallies, conferences, and schools, urging people to confront systemic racism head-on. Change doesn't happen overnight, she often said, but every voice matters. Every action counts. Her efforts inspired countless others to join the fight. Young activists organized marches. Teachers incorporated discussions about racial justice into their lesson plans. Even local politicians began proposing reforms aimed at increasing police transparency and accountability. Slowly but surely, seeds of progress were planted. For Kyle, life behind bars offered little comfort. Prison was harsh, isolating, and humbling. At first, he kept to himself, avoiding conversations with fellow inmates who quickly learned about his past as an officer convicted of shooting an unarmed woman. Some mocked him, others ignored him entirely. Days stretched into weeks, and Kyle found solace only in the quiet moments spent reflecting on his choices. During mandatory counseling sessions, Kyle opened up about his feelings of guilt and shame. His therapist encouraged him to write letters, not just to express remorse, but also to document his journey toward understanding. At first, the task felt daunting. What could he possibly say to someone like Michelle? How could words ever undo the harm he had caused? Still, Kyle persisted. In one letter, he wrote, "I don't expect forgiveness for what I've done. I know now that my actions were wrong, and I'll carry that weight for the rest of my life. But I want you to know that I'm trying to learn, to see the world differently, to recognize the biases I didn't even realize I had. If anything good can come from this tragedy, I hope it's that others will learn too." He didn't send the letter immediately. unsure whether Michelle would even read it. Instead, he tucked it away, adding to it over time as his thoughts evolved. Writing became a form of therapy, helping him process his emotions and confront the parts of himself he had long ignored. Meanwhile, Michelle continued her mission, balancing advocacy work with her responsibilities as an FBI agent. Though her cover had been blown during the trial, her superiors reassigned her to a new role within the Bureau, one focused on training officers to handle high-pressure situations without resorting to excessive force. It was a fitting position given her experience, and Michelle embraced it wholeheartedly. One day, while preparing materials for a workshop, Michelle received a package. Inside was a plain envelope containing Kyle's letter. Her hands trembled slightly as she unfolded the pages, scanning the words written in neat, careful handwriting. She read it twice, her emotions shifting between anger, sadness, and something resembling empathy. Though tempted to dismiss the letter altogether, Michelle decided to respond. Sitting at her desk late that night, she penned a reply. "Your apology means little to me personally, because nothing can erase what happened. But if your regret is genuine, and if you truly intend to change, then perhaps there's value in sharing your story. People need to hear it, not to excuse your actions, but to understand how prejudice operates. Maybe then we can prevent others from making the same mistakes." She mailed the letter the next morning, unsure what outcome to expect. To her surprise, Kyle responded weeks later, thanking her for her honesty and vowing to continue working toward redemption. Their correspondence remained sparse and formal, yet it marked an important step forward for both of them. Back in the community, the ripple effects of the case continued to unfold. Protests sparked by Michelle's shooting evolved into sustained movements advocating for reform. Local leaders passed legislation requiring body cameras for all officers and mandating regular bias training. Schools introduced programs designed to teach students about privilege, discrimination, and allyship. Conversations once considered taboo became commonplace, fostering greater awareness and understanding. Even Emily, Kyle's wife, joined the effort. After separating from Kyle following his conviction, she dedicated herself to volunteering with organizations fighting racial injustice. "I can't undo what my husband did," she told friends, "but I can help create a future where things like this don't happen again." As months turned into years, the wounds began to heal, not completely but enough to allow for growth. Michelle returned to field work, resuming her undercover assignments with renewed purpose. She remained vigilant, ensuring that no one else fell victim to the same biases that had nearly cost her life. Kyle, too, emerged from prison a changed man. Parole restrictions limited his opportunities, but he found meaning in mentoring troubled youth, teaching them about accountability and second chances. His transformation wasn't perfect, nor was it universally accepted, but it represented progress, a small yet significant step toward reconciliation. Years later, Michelle stood on a stage addressing a packed auditorium. Her speech concluded with a message of hope. "We live in a flawed world, but we have the power to shape its future. By listening, learning, and standing together, we can build a society rooted in justice and equality. It won't be easy, but it's worth fighting for." As applause filled the room, Michelle allowed herself a rare smile. The road ahead promised challenges, but she faced them with courage and determination. Change was possible, even in the face of adversity. And though scars remained, they served as reminders of resilience, strength, and the unyielding pursuit of justice.